Oakland, California, March 13th, 1988. The lights hit the stage like a promise. America had been waiting to hear. 3 microphones, 3 spotlights, 3 men who had defined an era walking out of the wings and into a roar of applause that shook the walls of the arena. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., together again. The tickets had sold out in minutes. 17,000 seats gone before the announcement finished echoing. The tour was called Together Again, and the name itself was a kind of magic. These were the men of Camelot, the kings of the Copa, the lords of the sands. They were mythology walking in tuxedos, and America couldn't wait to see them. Frank came out first. He always came out first. He walked to center stage with that Sinatra stride, shoulders back, chin up, the walk of a man who had been famous so long he'd forgotten what anonymity felt like. He adjusted the microphone. He let the applause wash over him like warm water. Then he turned to the wings and said, "Let's bring out the other 2 bums." The audience laughed. Sammy came out dancing, because Sammy always came out dancing. Even at 62, he moved like the stage was the only place his body made sense. He hugged Frank. He waved to the crowd. He beamed. And then Dean walked out. A stagehand who worked that first Oakland show, a man named Terry, who had been setting up concerts since the 60s, said he knew something was wrong the moment Dean appeared. He looked smaller, Terry said. Not physically smaller, but diminished, like someone had turned down his volume. The other 2 were electric. Dean was just there. Terry watched him closely all night. The jokes landed. The songs were fine. The timing between the 3 of them had that old Rat Pack rhythm, the insults, the interruptions, the barely suppressed laughter. But Terry saw what the audience didn't. Between bits, when the lights shifted, Dean's face would go blank. Not sad, exactly. Blank, like he was somewhere else entirely. And then the spotlight would hit him and he'd snap back and you'd see that Dean Martin smile. But it was work. You could see it was work. Here is what the audience didn't know. Exactly 1 year and 8 days before that Oakland show, Dean Martin's son had died. Dean Paul Martin, Dino, had been flying an F-4 Phantom jet on a training mission when he crashed into the side of San Gorgonio Mountain. He was 35 years old. The wreckage wasn't recovered for months. The mountain had to melt before they could find what was left of him. Dean had never been the same. He had stopped performing. He had stopped leaving his house. He had stopped returning phone calls from everyone, including Frank, especially Frank. The Together Again tour was supposed to fix that. It was Frank's idea. Of course it was Frank's idea. Frank believed in momentum. Frank believed that if you kept moving, the darkness couldn't catch you. Frank had survived his own collapses by working through them, by forcing himself onto stages when every part of him wanted to disappear. He thought Dean could do the same. Get him back on stage. Frank had told people close to him. That's where Dean belongs. The audience will bring him back. It was the logic of a man who had always been able to fix things. It was the logic of a man who didn't understand that some things can't be fixed. A publicist who worked the first week of the tour, a woman named Sandra who had handled both Frank and Dean at various points in her career, said Frank was worried from the beginning. He wouldn't admit it, Sandra said. Frank never admitted weakness, not even in private. But I saw him watching Dean during the rehearsals, just watching, and his face, it was concerned, almost frightened. She paused. I'd never seen Frank Sinatra frightened of anything, but he was frightened of losing Dean. You could see it. The paradox of that opening night was simple. 17,000 people were watching the greatest reunion in entertainment history, and the man in the middle of it was already gone. To understand what happened on that tour, you must first understand what Frank and Dean had meant to each other. They had met in 1944, 2 young Italian-American singers trying to make it in a business that didn't make room for people with names like Sinatra and Crocetti. Frank was already famous then, the boy singer who made girls scream. Dean was nobody, a crooner from Ohio who had changed his name from Dino Crocetti because it sounded too foreign. They didn't become close right away. That took years. By the late 1950s, they were inseparable. Frank had survived his career collapse, his Oscar comeback, his transformation from teen idol to serious artist. Dean had survived Jerry Lewis, had reinvented himself as a solo performer, had proven that he was more than just the handsome one. They found in each other something rare, a friendship without competition. Frank competed with everyone. He kept score, tracked slights, remembered every favor and every betrayal. But with Dean, the scorekeeping stopped. Dean didn't want anything Frank had. Dean didn't need anything Frank could give him. Dean just wanted to play golf and drink bourbon and make people laugh. And that simplicity was a relief to Frank Sinatra, a musician who played in Frank's orchestra during the Rat Pack years, a trumpet player named Vincent, who later became a music teacher in Palm Springs, said the dynamic between them was like nothing he'd ever seen. Frank was the leader, Vincent said. Everyone knew that. Frank made the decisions. Frank set the tone. But Dean was the one Frank listened to, the only one. Vincent remembered a night at the Sands when Frank wanted to add a new song to the set. Something political. Frank was always getting political in those days. The band was ready. The arrangements were done. Dean listened to the song once. Then he said, "Too preachy, Frank. Let's stick with the drinking jokes." Vincent watched Frank's face. Anyone else says that, Frank explodes. Anyone else questions his judgment, they're out. But Dean said it, and Frank just nodded, took the song out, never mentioned it again. The friendship deepened through the decades. They survived the collapse of the Rat Pack. They survived the changing tastes that made their kind of entertainment seem old-fashioned. They survived marriages and divorces, and the slow erosion of the world that had made them kings. They survived because they had each other. Frank called Dean almost every week. Sometimes they talked for an hour. Sometimes they just traded insults and hung up. The content didn't matter. The ritual did. But after March 1987, Dean stopped answering. Frank tried everything. He called daily for the first month after Dino's death. Dean wouldn't come to the phone. Housekeeper said he was sleeping. Housekeeper said he was out. Housekeeper said he wasn't feeling well. Frank knew they were lies. He showed up at Dean's house unannounced. Dean let him in once. Frank found him sitting in a dark living room at 2 in the afternoon, wearing a bathrobe, staring at nothing. "Dag," Frank said, "you gotta come back." Dean looked at him. "Come back where?" he said. Frank didn't have an answer. A driver who worked for Frank during those months, a man named Eddie who had been with Sinatra for almost a decade, said Frank became obsessed with saving Dean. It was all he talked about, Eddie said. In the car, on the way to meetings, late at night when he couldn't sleep. "How do I get Dean back? What does he need? What can I do?" He was like a man trying to solve an impossible problem. Eddie remembered one night, driving Frank home from a dinner party. Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, "I've fixed a lot of things in my life, a lot of people. But Dean doesn't want to be fixed. And I don't know what to do with that." The tour was Frank's last idea. He pitched it to Dean personally, in that dark living room. In the fall of 1987, "The three of us," Frank said. "You, me, Sammy. One more time. The money's insane, but that's not why. It's because we belong on stage, Dag. That's who we are. You sit in this house. You're gonna disappear. You come on stage with me. You come back to life." Dean listened. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just nodded, slowly, and said, "Let me think about it." 2 weeks later, he agreed. Frank was elated. He told everyone that Dean was back. He told the press that the tour would be like the old days. He believed, really believed, that the lights and the applause and the old rhythms would heal something in Dean that nothing else could touch. He was wrong. The tour began in Oakland and moved through America like a victory lap for a war that had ended decades ago. Seattle, Vancouver, San Diego, Los Angeles, 17 cities, sold-out arenas, standing ovations every night, and every night, Dean Martin died a little more. A backup singer named Dolores, who worked the first 3 weeks of the tour, said she watched Dean deteriorate in real time. "The first few shows, he was professional," Dolores said. "Quiet backstage, but professional. He hit his marks, he sang his songs, he did the bits with Frank and Sammy. But by the second week, he was forgetting things. Lyrics would vanish mid-song. Dean would cover with a joke, a sip from his glass, a shrug that the audience read as charming. But Dolores saw his eyes in those moments. "Panic," she said. "Just for a second. Then he'd recover. But the panic was there, and it got worse every night. Frank noticed. Of course Frank noticed. Frank noticed everything, even when he pretended not to. But he didn't know what to do. A road manager named Phil, who coordinated logistics for the tour, said Frank would pace backstage during Dean's solo segments. He couldn't watch, Phil said. He'd stand in the wings for a minute, then walk away, then come back, like he was checking on a sick friend in the hospital, hoping this time would be different, and it never was. Phil remembered one night in Los Angeles, the Forum, their biggest show yet. Dean forgot the words to That's Amore. The audience didn't notice. The band covered. Dean improvised. The moment passed. But backstage, Frank was white. He just stood there, Phil said. Didn't say anything. Didn't yell. Didn't make a joke. Just stood there with this look on his face, like he was watching something die and couldn't stop it. The breaking point came in Chicago. April 1988. 5 weeks into the tour. Dean had been getting worse. The forgetting was more frequent now. The energy was lower. The jokes came slower. Sammy had started covering for him more, jumping in with a dance, a quip, a distraction to give Dean a moment to recover. But there was no recovering. A hotel maid who worked the floor where the performers stayed, a woman named Maria who had cleaned rooms at the hotel for 15 years, said she saw Dean in the hallway the night before he quit. It was 3 in the morning. He was wearing a bathrobe. He was just standing there, in the hallway, not moving. I asked if he needed something, Maria said. He looked at me like he didn't understand the question. Then he said, "I'm looking for the way out." I thought he meant the exit, so I pointed to the elevator. But he shook his head and went back to his room. She paused. I don't think he meant the elevator. The next morning, Dean called Frank. It was early, maybe 7 a.m. Frank wasn't a morning person, but he took the call. A security guard stationed outside Frank's suite, a man named Jerome who had worked for Sinatra on 3 previous tours, said he could hear Frank's voice through the door. First calm, then louder, then pleading. "Don't do this, Dag. We'll take a break, a week off, whatever you need. You can't quit. You can't just..." Then silence. Then Frank's voice, very quiet. Okay, I understand." Dean flew home that afternoon. He didn't say goodbye to Sammy. He didn't address the crew. He just packed his bag, got in a car, went to the airport, and disappeared. The tour continued without him. Frank and Sammy restructuring the show, adding performers, pretending that nothing was wrong. But everyone knew. The Together Again tour was over. The 3 men would never share a stage again. A flight attendant who worked Dean's flight back to Los Angeles, a woman named Christine who had been flying for Pan Am for 12 years, said she recognized him immediately. He sat in first class, by the window. He didn't order anything, didn't read, didn't watch the movie. He just looked out the window the whole flight. She debated whether to say something. She was a fan. She'd grown up watching his show. Finally, as they were landing, she leaned in and said, "Mr. Martin, I just wanted to say, I've loved your work my whole life." Dean turned and looked at her. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said. "That's very kind." Then he turned back to the window. His voice was polite, Christine said. But his eyes, there was nothing there, like he was already somewhere far away, like he was just waiting for the plane to take him the rest of the way. Frank Sinatra stood in a hallway in Chicago for a long time after that phone call. His security guard, Jerome, said Frank didn't move for almost 10 minutes. Just stood there, phone in his hand, staring at nothing. Then he made another call. To Sammy. "Dean's out," Frank said. "It's just us now." Jerome couldn't hear what Sammy said, but he heard Frank's response. "No, don't call him. He needs..." Frank hung up. And for the first time in Jerome's years of working for him, Frank Sinatra looked old. The tour went on. Frank and Sammy finished the remaining dates. They brought in other performers, Liza Minnelli, guest comedians, anyone to fill the Dean-shaped hole in the show. The audiences still came. The reviews were still positive, but something was missing. Everyone felt it. A lighting technician who worked the final show of the tour, a man named Garrett who had done lights for all 3 Rat Pack members at various points, said the last night was strange. Frank was professional. He always was. But there was this moment, near the end, when he was supposed to make a joke about Dean. It was in the script, something about our missing friend, or the Italian who's probably on a golf course right now. Standard stuff. Garrett watched from the booth. Frank got to the line, and he just stopped, looked at the empty space where Dean used to stand, and he couldn't say it. He skipped it, moved on to the next bit. But I saw his face in that moment. Garrett paused. It was grief. Not anger, not frustration. Grief, like he was already mourning someone who was still alive. Dean went home to Beverly Hills and closed the door. He didn't perform again. Not really. A few small appearances, charity events, nothing that mattered. The television show was long gone. The movies were ancient history. The king of cool had abdicated. He sat in dark rooms. He watched the hours pass. He waited for something, though no one knew what. And Frank called. Every week, like clockwork, for the next 7 years. Sometimes Dean answered. Mostly he didn't. When he did answer, the conversations were short. Frank would ask how he was doing. Dean would say fine. Frank would ask if he needed anything. Dean would say no. Frank would say he was thinking about him. Dean would say thanks, then silence. Then Frank would say goodbye, and the line would go dead. A housekeeper who worked for Dean in the early 90s, a woman named Esperanza, who had been with the family for years, said she watched this ritual happen dozens of times. Mr. Sinatra would call. The phone would ring, and Mr. Martin would look at it like he wanted to answer but couldn't. Sometimes he would. Mostly he would let it ring. She remembered one call that Dean did take. It was 1993, maybe. She was in the next room, but she could hear Dean's side. Yeah, Frank. I know. I'm okay. No, I don't want to. I can't. Then, after a long pause, I know you do. I know. He hung up. Esperanza saw him sit there for a long time afterward, holding the phone like he was waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. What did Frank Sinatra learn from losing Dean Martin? It's a hard question to answer, because Frank was not a man who discussed his lessons. He was not a man who admitted defeat. He was not a man who accepted that some problems had no solutions. But people close to him said something changed after 1988. A pianist who played for Frank in his final years, a man named Bill who had known Sinatra since the 60s, said Frank mentioned Dean only once in his presence. It was late at night, after a show. Frank was drinking alone at a piano bar. Bill was packing up his sheet music. You know what I never understood? Frank said. Not really to Bill. Not really to anyone. Bill waited. Dean could always walk away. From anything. From Jerry. From his marriages. From the stage. He just walked. And I never could. I always had to stay and fight. Had to fix it. Had to win. Frank took a drink. And you know what? Dean was smarter. Sometimes there's nothing to fix. Sometimes walking away is the only thing you can do. I just never learned how. Bill didn't know what to say. Frank didn't seem to expect a response. He just sat there staring at his glass until Bill left. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Alone, in his bedroom, in the dark. Frank learned about it from a phone call. He didn't go to the funeral. His health was failing, and his people said he wasn't up to it. But those who knew him said he cried. Frank Sinatra, the man who never showed weakness, who never let them see him bleed, cried for Dean Martin. And then he did something strange. A friend of Frank's from Palm Springs, a golf buddy named Richard who had known both men for decades, said Frank asked him to come over a few days after Dean died. They sat on Frank's patio. They didn't talk much. Then Frank said, I should have left him alone. Richard asked what he meant. The tour. I pushed him. He wasn't ready. He was never going to be ready. And I made him do it anyway, because I thought I knew better. Because I always think I know better. Frank looked at the desert. And now he's gone. And I'll never know if I made it worse. Richard didn't have an answer. Some questions don't have answers. Here is what the Together Again tour taught the people who witnessed it. That love is not always enough. That good intentions can cause harm. That the strongest man in the room is sometimes the one who walks away. And that watching someone disappear, slowly, night after night, is its own kind of death. Frank Sinatra lived another 3 years after Dean. He performed less. He stayed home more. He became, in his own way, a version of what Dean had become. A man waiting for something to end. When Frank died in 1998, the newspapers called him the last of the Rat Pack. But the Rat Pack had really ended a decade earlier, in a hotel hallway in Chicago, when Dean Martin said, "I can't do this anymore." And Frank Sinatra, for once in his life, couldn't find a way to make him stay. Some things can't be fixed. Some friends can't be saved. Some doors once closed never open again. Frank Sinatra spent his whole life believing he could control the world, and mostly he could, but he couldn't control Dean Martin. He couldn't stop him from grieving. He couldn't stop him from leaving. He couldn't stop him from dying. All he could do was call, every week for 7 years, hoping that this time Dean would pick up, hoping that this time he'd hear the old voice, the old laugh, the old, "Hey, Pally," but that voice was gone. It had walked off a stage in Chicago and never come back. And Frank Sinatra, the man who could do anything, could only watch. The lights go down eventually for everyone. The applause fades. The stage empties, and the ones who are left behind stand in the wings, watching, wondering if they could have done something different, wondering if there was ever anything they could have done at all.